Okay. Hi, Siv. Hi, Bridget. Hello, Liz, Peter. Well, I'm going to have to say hello to lots of people and welcome to people that I do know and plenty of people I hope that we don't know either. But it's always good to see familiar faces. Siv, welcome. You were also part of Desire, so it's great to see Desire colleagues arriving. I'll give it a couple of minutes to let everybody get here and arrive. More people are, we're all, oh, no, don't need to message everybody. Comes Sean. Great. It's really, thank you all very much for taking time out of your lunch to join us today. I'll give it a couple more seconds and then because we've got quite a busy agenda of dialogues and different things to get through. I will get started. Hello, Sean. Hi, Christina. Um, I will begin fairly promptly to honour the time that you are giving us. Here comes Olivia. So, hi, Olivia. Welcome. And here comes Alice. Okay, can I leave you now, Al, with admitting people who come in so that we can begin. So welcome everybody. Before we actually begin today, maybe a little bit of context. So Desire, as a new European Bauhaus program, finished about a year ago, and you may be wondering why now for a webinar about the inside story of Desire. And there are a couple of reasons why now. So some of us, a handful of us, perhaps on this call, have just finished the next series of major calls for proposals for the new European Bauhaus program, in which for the first time there were calls entitled Regenerative. So it felt like a good moment to reflect on what has changed since we first joined Desire back in 2021 and what hasn't. And secondly, perhaps and more importantly, a pattern we're seeing across many different levels of society in the UK and much more widely about how the pressures of polarization in society are affecting courage, confidence, behavior, and how very much harder that makes it to stay in any kind of right relationship between us. And those effects are coming from different sources, from growing anxiety about the effects of climate change, from increased anxiety about economic instability and geopolitical instability. And at the sort of smaller grassroots level in the UK, where I live, over the summer and in the autumn, we've seen an outburst of national flags on streets that's making many people feel really uncomfortable. And a really small example hit me a couple of months ago, which will be familiar to anyone in a UK municipality on this call, for example, that has been through the period we call austerity, which was an organisation facing contraction due, with multiple viable projects, departments, and teams, was responding from a point of view of scarcity and fear and thinking about closing just one project in its entirety rather than looking at redistributing resources and time for the project. And in the middle of that, you start to hear conversations about whose jobs are more worth protecting because they have children and mortgages and others don't. Now, I don't know if that's familiar to you, but it really made me gasp because the logic of your life matters less because you haven't reproduced, has a lot of historical precedence. And it's one small example, but the question is not that scenario, but what external systemic societal pressures are being brought to bear across relationships to call out more of that kind of behavior. So our context is also we're in a period where institutional stress, organizational stress, societal stress is revealing what actual value systems operate beneath the surface. And for us, a question is, do we contract around scarcity and hierarchy or expand towards mutualism and resilience? And those choices that we make now are practice for harder times ahead. And the third reason was because we've been really busy and we're terribly disorganized and we haven't made time until now. So here we are, and welcome to this webinar, which is going to hopefully take no more than 90 minutes. And we may well be finished before then. But let me just share my screen so that I can give you a sense of what we're going to try to cover. And see if I can do present in this. Is it working? Can you see my screen? Yeah, is that working? Fantastic. Okay. So a few quick introductions to the people who are going to be on this call. Then in our regenerative tradition, we're going to have a short 5-minute breakout wake-up question so that you can build relationships with others on this call. Then Orsa and Al Mathers and Olivia, who I'll introduce in a second, are going to just have a quick reflection on the process of desire. And then Al and I will share the report and recommendations that are in it. And then we'll have hopefully time for lots of questions and dialogues between us, and we will then close. So those of us hosting this call today, I am the founder of Really Regenerative. Dr. Al Mathers, who worked with me on the Desire Project. You can see her with one of our beautiful illustrations behind her on the screen, I hope. Orsa Holen Nilsson, that you can hopefully is waving, who was the chief coordinator, chief weaver, and chief saver of relationships, we call her on Desire. And Olivia Thomason-Harrow, who was a chief storyteller and weaver of stories across Desire, who also has a young baby. So we will hopefully, Olivia will hopefully join us on the call, but we know you'll all understand if baby takes precedence, because they should and they do and they have to. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a community interest company. We've got 4 key areas of work that we're involved in. We are mainly capability and capacity builders through our learning journeys. That is actually how we came to be invited to be in Desire in the first place. Power of Place that you can see on screen is our signature 9-month regenerative design learning journey. We support place-based transformative programs and projects, some of which have emerged through our learning journeys, our own bioregional work in West Sussex and in the Azores. And we also publish and carry out research provocations and produce different types of reports, of which the Relational Edge is one. Also, I'm going to invite you to introduce Blocks Hub.
Thank you, Jenny. As you see here, Blocks Hub is a Nordic hub for sustainable urbanization. We are located in Copenhagen, and we're both a co-working space, but also an ecosystem with members, approximately 400 companies, but also public and private organizations of any kind, also international organization. All our members are combined in a combined effort to work with sustainable urbanization in some way. It could be as through architecture, design, construction, tech, but it could also be as an urban planner or thought leader, but also working with social and democratic aspects of it. And yeah, we do a lot of activities, and internationally we engage both with European partners and in European projects, but we also engage beyond Europe, primarily in Japan, but also in United States. with the common aim of creating better cities with whatever that implies.
Thanks, Åsa. Blocks Hub was one of the key and the lead partners in the Desire Consortium. So for those of you who are not familiar with Desire or even New European Bauhaus, New European Bauhaus is one of the flagship projects within EU Horizon that is looking very specifically at the built environment, construction, architecture, social housing, what the future should be and could be about. And Desire was one of the winning first tranche of projects that were awarded in early 2022. And we joined the consortium in 2021 when we were a very, very fledgling organization. And it was 24 different partners that came together, working in 5 different countries, Denmark, Italy, Slovenia, the Netherlands, and Latvia, to explore what the enabling conditions would be to create irresistible circular societies. So designing irresistible circular societies was shrunk down and called Desire. And I guess over a 2-year period, which was very short and very intense, we learned an enormous amount of different things. But the work that we were doing at Really Regenerative, alongside our external work with several of the sites, was also looking at the context of relationality across a 24 partner consortium and within a couple of specific sites, which is what this report is about. So it's our tradition and it's our practice in Really Regenerative to put relationship before task. So before we begin our discussions and the meat of this report, we'd like to offer you an opportunity to meet someone new who has registered and is participating in this website. So we're going to organize a little breakout for just 5 minutes with 2 people in each breakout. Take 2.5 minutes each. I will leave you to be responsible for your timing. And share from the heart, speak from the heart, listen deeply to each other. What was it that brought you here today? What was it that prompted you to come to this webinar rather than eat lunch or go to many other webinars? And what is the crossroads you're at in the context of relationality right now? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I'm a person who cannot chew gum and work at the same time, and set the breakout groups, which I hope I'm going to do enough of. And you should hopefully see an invitation arriving about now. Everybody got an invitation? Great. We will see you back in 5 minutes. We always are stretched with time. So I am curious to hear if you'd like to drop into the chat what struck you about meeting somebody you didn't know in that way on a question. What felt different relationally about that? So, and if you'd like to, yeah, please do pop in the chat. You went deep, very quickly, Bridget. Fantastic. So I'm going to invite now Åsa and Olivia and Al. If I can, this is what happens when your Zoom room host has the lurgy and you end up having to do it yourself. So I am going to try and spotlight. Where is Olivia? There you are. So that we are all. Okay, how many spotlights are you allowed to have? Not enough, obviously. Can't spotlight you, Olivia. Why can't I do that? Co-host. Olivia. Okay, maybe I can't spotlight more than 3 people in that case. Maybe I could unspotlight myself. Perhaps that's the best way. Okay, Olivia. Give me a moment, folks, and I will get this right, she said, hopefully. Okay. Hurrah, I did it finally. Okay, so Ursa, Olivia, and Al. There are many people here who haven't been part of New European Bauhaus, but will have been part of consortiums working on calls for proposals and funding bids. So, what do you recall from the journey of convening the consortium going into the call for proposal? What do you recall that you noticed at the time that was maybe important relationally? Ursa, I'm going to go to you first.
Okay. Well, I think the process we had by building up the consortium was a huge process and was set by the invitation to define how we were perceiving in Denmark or in any European countries the new European Bauhaus initiative as it was presented by Ursula von der Leyen back in September 2021. And in that process went a lot of work and a lot of different stakeholders. I think there were 250 different stakeholders. And out of it came the idea that was this defining desire, the idea about you need to create, or you need to talk about irresistibility. You need to make the green transition so attractive that it barely seems like a choice. That was the output, which seemed to us, well, I was not part of it, but to the Danish consortium as a very strong starting point, you could say, and something that a lot of people, a lot of organization could refer to or adhere to. It was something of importance.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it was easy to build up the consortium. It was sometimes a struggle to make the boundaries of the consortium because more people wanted to become involved. But it was also something that those who were not part of the work developing this idea also could relate to easily,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, so you focused in the early days, and how long was that process?
Well, the process of defining the irresistibility concept was about, I think it was in total 6 months or something
Okay.
like this, with a lot of workshops going on in Denmark. I was not involved at that time, but except for that, I was observing it from a sideline. But it was quite. I think the work there was quite extensive, and the output was also something that was used
Yeah.
in building the consortium.
So you were focused on creating a shared purpose across time. And were all of the people that came or organizations that came in and out of those discussions, did everybody join the consortium in the end? What was the flow of people in and out like?
Well, it was well, we had a core group, you could say, but the flow in and out was also based on how the dialogue in that group developed. Because suddenly we realized, oh, we need somebody with this competences or insight, and they were invited and they gave their contributions. Some of them were not even part of the work preceding building the consortium, so they were new to this work. There were also other organizations who had taken part in Denmark in the preceding work during these 6 months that were not at first stage invited to take part in the proposal or the development of the proposal, and who insisted on becoming part of it. So we had to find a way to involve them somehow because they really wanted to be part of it.
Yeah. I think what was interesting to us as Really Regenerative, because we were one of those people to be invited in for a particular competence. So I think Siv is on the webinar, and Next Agency were on our very, very first Power of Place learning journey back in 2021. And from that experience, invited us into the consortium. So we were relatively late arrivals into that consortium. Um, but to most of our surprises, I think in that first very competitive bid, we won. But what do you, both of you, Olivia and also Olivia, if you can, I suspect baby may be calling your attention. What do you recall about the early challenges of a 24 partner multi-stakeholder consortium where actually most of us didn't know each other?
Yeah. I can go first. I think I have a little window right now. Um, one thing I remember when I started on the project, which was when the project started, was that we kept saying, we only have 2 years.
Yeah.
We only have 2 years. It was like the phrase I heard the most times in the beginning. And so it kind of meant that, sorry, one moment, that we had to act really, really fast in many ways, both in terms of getting people together really fast and what we call the sites, like the places that were doing a lot of the workshops and experimentation, they had to move very fast too. And we had to move fast in terms of understanding what was unfolding. So the way I remember it is that we had to both think, act, and do, and reflect and report simultaneously. It was almost like a wheel of layers that we were spinning around the whole time, and that's how I recall it. And I think that brought about some challenges. And it made it very clear. I think it was both very generative. It made us do a lot of stuff, maybe be a bit bolder, but also it also made it clear very fast when maybe we weren't that aligned, where we had different understandings of like, how do you do research in this kind of project, or how do you understand participation, or why don't we call it I don't know, a citizen, or these kind of like small things, but can be really, really big between people, I think. So that's one thing that I recall from those early days.
Yeah, I recall it being quite turbulent, shall we say?
Yeah, exactly.
Also, what do you, as the project coordinator, which everybody on this call will know is an incredibly tough role, what comes to mind?
It's very interesting to hear it from you also, Olivia, because it's also because we started with so different starting points. You were completely new to the project. I wrote the application together with a team, of course, but I knew what it was about. So this awareness about the differences in starting points. And also this very Danish way of working, that we just dive in to do things with really not considering it important to relate to each other, because
not just a Danish thing, hint.
Okay. Yeah. But the way that we know each other quite well in Denmark, we're sort of a kind of a homogenic culture, you could say. And there's no need to get to know each other because we almost know what we think, even though we don't know each other. So let's just do. And of course, Olivia, you are completely right. It was a short project, and that made also a bit of a sort of nerve, I think, to the beginning of it, and sense of urgency.
So I think what I'm hearing there, I think that it's quite interesting, is that though in the prior process to getting the bid written, there'd been a real focus on shared purpose, that once we had won, though we thought we had a shared purpose, we didn't have shared understanding across 24 different organizations about what we actually meant by designing irresistible circular societies. And Al, you came into the project as a new person working for Really Regenerative that was also new into the consortium. What do you recall as the first sort of things that you noticed?
I think it was the complexity. Desire was very, very complex, and everything was about the connections and relationships, but on a variety of levels and scales. So you were having to, as Olivia and Orsa were saying, kind of think and do simultaneously without that full picture or time to understand what all those connections could be and where actually you could see real kind of potential for them to grow. Because I think the role that I had was very much focused in working in place with the Cullenborg site. And so I had a sense of those wider relationships and connections, but not necessarily the deep understanding of, oh, we're seeing something that actually could be taken and could be something that could either inspire or connect with something else. So I think what I understood was the critical nature, for example, of Olivia's role in the second half of the program, where actually there was someone who was holding some of those complex story connections and making it visible, because otherwise I think it would have been quite a big story of separation, given all of the ways the sites were working.
I think that's really true. But even with those, we had constraint of time, we had constraints of 24 different organizations with lots of different people in them. We did succeed in 2 years in producing some really excellent work, I think. So, what do you think also made the difference to achieving that despite all of the constraints we were working with?
First of all, I think we somehow also learned along the project when it was sort of developing. For me, it was also the first time I had developed a project of this size. It was the first time I coordinated a project of this size. I've been working in international environment for many years, but it was the first time, and for this specific area. So I didn't know what I was doing. Well,
beginner's mind is a powerful thing.
Yeah, you could say so. And it was also a way of working out, really seeing the different opportunities and options in the consortium. And of course, I knew the project because by heart. So I did know about the relations that we created. And everybody said it was a very complex project. It was, but of course, I was in advance because I knew the complexity because I sort of described it myself. But but it was this kind of not setting up too many constraints for ourselves, in the sense that we didn't have any KPIs except from those that was linked to dissemination and engagement. So we had a fairly open playground, you could say. And that also created the opportunity to sort of navigate and take in what emerged along the road. Yeah. And of course, we did have our bumpy parts of the road. I remember when we met at our second physical consortium meeting I think it was month 7 into the project. We had a kind of really rough discussion, even harsh.
Rebellion occurred, as I recall.
Yeah, that's true. But still, that was also the meeting where I realized perhaps we need to understand this project.
Yeah.
And
each other.
We need also to understand the relationship we have with each other into this project. Yeah. See how we fit into this 2 years project as small devices in a big machine, or whatever you would like to use as a metaphor. And we did a rich picture drawing of all the different elements. And for me, that was, people were saying, okay, now I see.
I see how I fit.
Yeah, I see how I fit. And that's perhaps also why it gave such a sort of clash between different opinions, because people suddenly saw, yes, I know now where I fit, and therefore I get a voice in telling that this is not how I want to work. This is not how I see it. So we got everything up in, not everything, but a lot of things out into the open. And I think what sort of saved it was also that all of us still found the overall objective of the project interesting and relevant. And I remember from that meeting, one of the consortium, one of the organizations came to me at the very end of the meeting when we had this rush, and he said he really loved to be part of this because it was being part of the Desire family.
Yeah.
He said, so it was this kind of, okay, in a family, sometimes you discuss and you have rough times, but you still have the sense of being together. You're still a family. So that's what he expressed to me.
Yeah. So I'm curious, folks, listening to our short conversation here, which I'll wrap up with one last question, because this webinar is really about the inside story of Desire, not all of the outer reporting that gets published on the website, all of the glossy, shiny outputs, but an opportunity to explore the messiness of human relationships that went on inside this process. So I'm just curious to hear from you. Pop in the chat if you like, if these scenarios are familiar to you and familiarly challenging to you, if they are things that are commonplace in your consortium world or project creation world. For us, they're very familiar and very commonplace. And maybe hosting a webinar about human messiness isn't necessary, but I feel that for us, signposting the inside journey rather than the external outcomes feels important. So one last question to all of you. Was there anything in particular that each of you took forward from the process of Desire? Both of you, all of you have been through our learning journey, Power of Place now, but is there anything that you take forward from our attempts to weave into what was essentially a circular sustainable project, regenerative design and development? So in many ways, Really Regenerative was acting in a very provocative way by bringing something into the consortium that was actually not in the original proposal, that you feel is serving you in your other individual work going forward.
I think for me, it was the focus that came through on the need to work with adaptation and evolution and how to support that within a short time frame, because so many projects do work. I mean, Desire was 2 years, but so many projects can be 6 months. So how can you acknowledge that that is the approach from the outset and work with it and still feel that the time is well spent? I think that was really critical for me going forward.
Thanks, Al. Awesome, Olivia.
Well, let you answer first, Olivia, please.
Yeah, sure. I think something that I really loved about learning about regeneration and regenerative design was this idea of giving back. I think we talked about, Jenny, you talked about it in Power of Place. Yeah, both giving back to the community you work with, but also to land. For me, it also maybe ties a bit into this idea of reciprocity. It's really hard.
Mutualism, reciprocity, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which also is, for me, what ties very deeply to the idea of relationality, that there is a sense of, it's not just exchange, it's different, right? Or it's something else that's more caring, and it's more genuine, and it's more sustainable, I would claim too. So that's something that I learned about regeneration from this project that I try to hold on to, I think.
Yeah. And we were delighted, we have to say, Olivia, to acknowledge publicly how two of our very irritating mantras that we kept on and on and on about for 2 years were relationship before task, potential, look for potential, not problem solving, appeared beautifully in the language of all of your storytelling reports. So we were very happy about that. And also, what was true for you?
Well, I think for me, this project made it crystal clear what you said about relationship before task, because and also this awareness about the different perspectives, which I should be, because I do have a sort of background in system thinking of practice, but still it's something you need to practice. It's something you need to learn. So this kind of importance of relationship before task, of course, but also the messiness, that it's okay. And I still, well, when you develop new projects and new proposals, new applications, as I do in my daily work, I need to be able to live with this kind of chaos and this kind of messy relationships with others or the stakeholders involved. And I also experience that it's so difficult for many people to accept this, even though you do it in structured. There's so many things that appear, and things are so moving sometimes that it's extremely difficult also in relationships. That but this project learned me that even though you have this feeling, you can still come up with something that is really valuable in the end. And it's sometimes even the messiness that brings it, because it opens up towards you being yourself in the context you're working from, and with those relationships you work together with.
Right. So thank you also, Olivia and Al. I'm going to unspotlight you now. Olivia and also may have to leave us now. So if there are any questions that you are holding that you would like to put to Åsa and Olivia, please do put them in the chat and share them. I'm sure that they will love to respond. I think the conversation probably, I hope, highlights, we started with the word complexity, the complexity of human relationships in multi-stakeholder projects. Because even in a small group of 10 people, you will have different paradigms of consciousness from which people are operating. You will have different cultural backgrounds. I'm brought to mind of a fantastic book called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, which really played out in our consortium. You will have different life experiences and histories, which are always invisible to you from the person presenting, and lots of different personalities and characters. So we are now working with a high degree of complexity, not just in the projects, but across the relational conditions of multi-stakeholder groups. I think that is also true. So now Al and I are going to try to give you a whistle-stop tour through the core pillars of the report and the recommendations. It will be fast because we want to leave room for your questions and discussions, ideally 15 minutes before the end. So we've got about half an hour to crack through. But please also, I would invite you to put questions in the chat so that we can try and address everything for people who may have to leave before the end of the webinar. Okay, so back to the slides. Let's make sure I share the right screen rather than the wrong screen, because it's that time of the year when I'm also doing my tax return, and I'm very sure you don't want to see it. So, okay, here we go. Let's find the right screen. There it is. Okay. Present full screen. Great. Oh, is it going to do full screen? Present. There we go. Okay, Al, just a couple of words.
So this is just to give a bit of background to, I suppose, the role that Really Regenerative played within Desire. It was both being brought in as what was described as an expert organisation, but increasingly we took on a role of embedding this approach to documentation and deeper learning. So we did that both at a place level, capturing through the work of the Kalundborg team and the associated teams on the ground, the visual story of place of Kalundborg, but it also meant weaving in a number of different approaches that complemented that. I think that idea of complexity is really important in thinking about that embedded learning role. So it was activating a resourcing role, documenting in an ongoing approach what happened week on week and reflecting on those and revisiting those with the team. It was also about synthesizing at a next level what was coming through. So what were we learning? What were the themes over time? And then building upon that through a variety of media, external conversations, photography, dialogue, meeting notes, so that we really ended up with a very rich picture of what was emergent through our learnings. So I'll pass back to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Al. And I think it's also important to say that this is our perspective only, with all of the biases that we as individuals and a team bring to this. And we acknowledge that. So the first pillar from which all of the others really cascade was the real importance of creating an environment in which we prioritize shared understanding and relationship before task. So one of living systems core principles is the importance of dynamic co-mutual relationship, which I hope the clownfish and anemone story illustrates there, but we don't have time to dive into that into too many details. So a core way of working for us is to prioritize that, creating the social infrastructure, the conditions and the developmental learning that enables people to prioritize relationship in an effective way over a period of time and across multiple different conditions that individuals bring to it. And so some slightly deeper examples from what showed up in Desire. So the EU absolutely loved our title, particularly the concept of irresistibility. But one of the things that we did from the immediate kickoff is completely ignore that in our process of looking at a hypothesis of developing principles that you can see on the screen that we would experiment with. And our role was to be the annoying organization that perhaps kept asking questions, but don't you think we should talk about, understand what we mean by irresistibility before we develop principles to test on? There also wasn't any real structure or process for relationship building and understanding in the early stages of the project. And something that I think also alluded to that was really particular was that if I give the example of Kalundborg, where we were working, there was us as an expert organization interested in regenerative design and development from place. There was the municipality that was very interested in the arrival of the Royal Danish Architecture School that was opening its first non-Copenhagen site in Kalundborg, in outside of the city, in what was to be a very new, shiny educational campus. there was Knowledge Hub Zealand that was really representing and interested in the community cohesion. So each of those organizations on their own, within the context of desire, had very different reasons for being there, that we didn't take instant time right at the beginning to explore and create even an element of shared understanding between us in one site team. And that was a pattern that really continued until the partner meeting that also spoke about, where all of the proverbial around that lack of understanding did actually hit, shall we say, the fan. But our approach inside that, particularly where as expert organizations, there hadn't been a lot of time and space to share what we could contribute. The sites, the very many different sites that were part of this project, were trying to work out what they were going to do to contribute to the project. We activated across the different members of the consortium what I would describe as a self-organizing, started to build self-organizing capability, because without the room and time and structure to build it, in order to work out who was going to partner with whom, what we were going to work on, how we were going to do it, an element of self-organizing, which is another core living systems principles, almost activated itself. But specifically within the partnership across Kalundborg and the Royal Academy of Architecture, we created the conditions that across the first 6 months, if not the first year, rather than diving straight into testing a pre-agreed set of principles that we hadn't had the opportunity in a very linear way, that we hadn't had the opportunity to allow to arise naturally through the stakeholder groups in Kalundborg, that we would have a period of time where we would convene multi-stakeholder groups and develop shared understanding and relationship across those different communities and give them time to express what values were important to them before we imposed a series of principles on them to test. And in particular, one of the things that was really important that we focused on is to ask the question, how could the arrival of the Royal Danish Academy create new regenerative potential in Kalundborg? And what did that regenerative potential have to be? How would we look for it, and what would we understand within it? And we effectively took our story of place process into Kalundborg, and allowed the history of the economy, the ecology, and the culture to express itself through a series of multi-stakeholder dialogues where the citizens told us what would be irresistible to them. And we then, in the second half of the programme, went on to experiment with that, which wasn't necessarily how the whole consortium had intended to proceed. But again, as Åsa said, we had so much flexibility in the early years of desire outside of the normal constraints, I think, of an EU funding bid, that we were able to play with potential and possibility. So amongst our core recommendations across any consortium would be to put time up front. We've just been in consortiums that have closed again for NEB, that have probably produced proposals in the last 3, 4, 5 weeks. And I think Desire showed that the value of coming together for 6 months, 12 months before submitting a proposal were really, really valuable. But even when we came together to put more time up front into building shared understanding as well as shared purpose before diving straight into tasks, that might sound very obvious, but it certainly wasn't obvious when we began this project. and really a focus to make sure all contributions were valued as a whole, rather than a slight hierarchy that appeared in the early stages where academic organizations felt more powerful than site-based organizations, and expert organizations just kind of had to fit in. And to support everybody across the program groups to really have the opportunity to work on and understand the complexity and the interrelatedness across individuals, across site projects, across organizations, and even inside NEB as a whole. So number two, falls, in fact, all of the next four principles fall out of the first. Al, I'm going to hand over to you for time and resource.
Thanks, Jenny. So in our first conversation, we mentioned the benefit in some ways of the 2-year time frame in terms of actually it did mean there was a huge amount of energy behind actually what could we create and what could we bring into being. However, the living systems principle of things emerging over time and transformative change taking time is a really challenging one when you've already been set these very kind of strict parameters. So Jenny, if you can move to the next page, please. So how this kind of showed up meant that, as Jenny was saying, there was a lot of really great foundational work that had been done almost to create an openness around kind of what that kind of time could allow the programme to do as a whole. So that focus on coming together before kind of looking at what that established set of core principles gave almost an opportunity for things to grow. However, there wasn't time and resource then to really think about, are these the right principles once we bring another layer of complexity and we're starting to work in place with communities in the site. So actually that limits the opportunity for emergence and in some ways also creates a challenge around how does that point of connection grow between people who join a programme and a consortium who are more distant from that understanding, that shared understanding at the beginning, and how do you situate those individuals, those places in relationship to the key questions that Desire was posing as a whole. Next slide, please, Jenny. So I suppose what we did was think about how could this be addressed at a number of nested scales. So it was really then focusing a huge amount of effort into the first half of Desire to really bring that kind of focus on regenerative practice into being. When we were therefore working directly with partners, that meant about kind of building those kind of capabilities to think about what could be still emergent, how could things still evolve. And it meant very practically when we were working at place level, actually putting time and commitment into building those face-to-face relationships, building an understanding of the small details that made up the whole environment. So that idea of walking meetings between core members of the team on the ground became really, really important. Just walking the site created a space and time to explore things that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Next slide.
I think just to add to that, Al, it's also true that we recognized early on that as a partner, we were not resourced to do that work going in. So we as an organization, because it's an important priority for us, had to find additional resource and time to enable that pilot testing of this approach inside the organization.
Yeah, so I think that just underlines kind of these recommendations. There are really big kind of financial implications for working in this way, and therefore for funders to really understand that actually creating space within budgets and proposals that enable a focus on deeper participatory processes and working with emergence and experimentation. And it was really, really key that therefore, that whilst we within the desire almost viewed this, as Jenny was saying, as a way of piloting the approach, that becomes something that's recognised more as standard going forward. Thanks, Jenny. So, oh, sorry, you go.
You go, Al, sorry.
Okay. So our third, I suppose, a key takeaway from this work was really about working in right relationship and what that meant. As Jenny mentioned, one of the key ways in which living systems thrive and prosper is around co-mutualism. And that means actually really thinking on a number of deep levels about how that works between individuals and systems, and actually addressing some of those inequalities and power structures from the start. Next page, please, Jenny. We mentioned about the complexity that was ever present within desire. And actually, when we look at that complexity, that's ever present within the world as a whole and becoming more and more visible to all of us in our day-to-day lives. But what it also shows is that when things become more connected and complex, actually you can have more visibility of hierarchies that are borne out, but come into close proximity of unequal distribution of resources within a programme. So this was in terms of, it might be budgets or time that was given to certain partners that maybe wasn't thought about in terms of other partners from the start. And that can cause fractures within programs, because it's harder then for everyone to give all the commitment that they need if they aren't adequately resourced to the same level. So one of the things we did as a result was really thinking about how do we build structures that enable some of those conflicts, motivations, and varying perspectives become visible, and actually, rather than something that can polarize, something that can actually be seen as a resource to create a rich idea of the whole. So we did that working in Kalundborg from the outset by creating, as Jenny was saying, multi-stakeholder group spaces where actually it spoke to that potential and the passions that people held by weaving together a collective story. It was also about very practically thinking there's a future here, but to actually move towards that future, what are the things that people need to see changing in a small number of interim states? So those were things that actually could give hope that working together collectively, that working through some of these challenges actually still produced change on the ground. I think then in terms of our recommendations, the point around resourcing is really, really key in terms of creating right relationships. But it's also about creating those spaces where voices are equally heard and respected. And that's about creating spaces that people feel safe coming together in, and that it's not a hierarchical space where one person will lead and others will follow. Over to you, Jenny.
Sorry, I think it's also too, it's worth pointing out here, and we might be able to be pointing out later, so I might be repeating myself, Al, forgive me if I am, that social infrastructure inside our team, core team, field team, and task team that we work with enabled us in two ways. Firstly, through multi-stakeholder dialogues about how does the story of separation that you can see behind Al and I play out in Kalundborg. And that was playing out in the predominance of the Symbiosis, which is a world famous industrial site in Kalundborg that produces 40% of the insulin for Europe, 50% of the enzymes that are used in many different ways. That was such a dominant industrial structure that had actually brought no real value and benefits to the citizens of Kalundborg, who were very, very left out of that. And the municipality and the education system were all operating as separate silos rather than contributing to the future potential and wholeness of Kalundborg. that was something out of those dialogues grew a new entity that was called the Phoenix team, which was a multi-stakeholder group that wanted to form and work towards a regenerative and sustainable future for Kalundborg. The fourth one I can go quickly through because it may be something that was just very particular to Desire that we noticed, which was around capabilities and skills for collective participatory experimentation. So evolution happens through iterative experimentation over very long, vast periods of time. But there's no automatic capability built into multi-stakeholder consortiums that come together to design experiments. And that was something that showed up very early on in Desire because we hadn't worked on understanding mutual comprehension between site representatives and expert organizations who did have knowledge and expertise in participatory process and designing the appropriate approaches to experimentation. There was quite a confused period of time where it was clear that those capabilities did not necessarily exist within the sites. And if they didn't, the outcomes of the principles that we would be testing might be at risk and compromise. So there was also concurrently a need to let go of that kind of control, being uncomfortable working with ongoing uncertainty and not knowing appropriate processes. So a paradox, if you will, that we also, as multiple different groups, sat with, out of which grew insightful understanding and innovations. But that development of shared practice was really in a short period of time of 2 years, almost constantly at risk, that we didn't always give time and attention to the quality of design approaches that we might otherwise have done. Now, it's handy to have the benefit of hindsight. What we don't know and will never know is whether if we had paid more attention to developing that shared understanding and comprehension and design processes, whether the outcomes would have been better, worse, or different. We were simply there observing during that period of time that those processes weren't necessarily there. So we put, as we've mentioned, a lot more time into Kalundborg to support the design and development of participatory, collective and experimentative processes. And I guess if we were making recommendations, which we were in the report, what didn't happen in Desire, which we don't know if it's common elsewhere, it might have been just our collective, was that those early matching processes between expert organizations and sites that were going to carry out experiments really adds to the potential of effective inquiry and experiment design. And that beginning future programs with that deeper internal participatory process would have enabled both academic and site partners to step into what eventually became, under the pressure of 2 years, co-creative collaborations much earlier on. And again, that putting more resources and availability for organizations that specialize and really understand how to recognize tensions and conflict or emergent potential, perhaps, rather than conflict resolution, would be really important. So number 5, because I'm watching the clock here and going a little bit fast so that we do have time for questions, was really about, for us, the next two are probably the things that made our nostrils as regenerative practitioners twitch quite a lot. Is how do you value emergence in these kind of funded projects? So emergence, convergence, and divergence is the process with which living systems evolve. And our question as an organization we're already holding is, what is it to be really regenerative, and how do we bring emergence and therefore uncertainty, not knowing, into the structure of large EU projects? Al, over to you.
So I think the idea of programs being linear is a real challenge to working in this way. And I think that alongside that, taking a hypothesis-driven approach is very challenging to being able to learn with places, learn with organizations, learn with individuals. And therefore, that's what we noticed showed up time and time again, this tension between what you have to write into a proposal and say what almost the outcomes are before you've got there, and then being able to give the time and space, and particularly to understand what learning with would really mean and take in terms of resource. Next slide, please, Jenny. So what we did in response to this was really focusing on an open approach to inquiry that centered on values and principles. It was about being able to create spaces and through a variety of activities where different people felt able to tell different stories about the principles that they valued, and to do that at a point in their engagement that felt right. As we mentioned in the earlier dialogue, people were coming in and out of the whole programme at different points throughout, and therefore welcoming people in was really critical and making those points of connection. And as a result, a new centre of life emerged, which Jenny mentioned, which was the formation of the Phoenix group. So they were a group who could hold this idea of emergence going forward, working on the ground. So some key learnings from this that we would take forward as recommendations for programme design is there has to be an understanding of a way in which proposals can go forward that focus on emergence, adaptation and evolution, that uncertainty is a part of all life, and therefore actually being able to fund proposals, partnerships, consortiums that have that commitment to learning together, to being focused on ongoing development and therefore mirroring the way in which dynamic living systems work is really critical. That means actually moving away from very tightly structured proposals to space within those to create more radical experimental approaches.
Thanks, Al. And so I guess our last sector, which is one of my personal bugbears in many programs that I've been in, is what we describe as making space to value biocultural uniqueness and scaling deep. So again, key principle: life values and thrives on diversity and difference. And recognizing biocultural uniqueness means for us working through the fractals of place from the bioregion to the neighborhood, and scale linking work as appropriate to those conditions rather than scaling cookie cutter solutions. And that a regenerative future is born out of honoring the unique conditions of a specific place, its specific ecology, its a specific culture, and its specific economy that grows out of those conditions. And Al has probably already alluded to, I think, the constraints both of the proposal process, not just for New European Bauhaus, but many proposals, is two of the first questions that you have to answer often is, how will your insights and outcomes scale across the whole of Europe and all of its marvelous diversity? How can your insights and processes be replicated across the whole of Europe's amazing diversity? what best practices will emerge that can be scaled? How can we boil down, reduce, synthesize to a handful of silver bullet insights that can be exported everywhere in a homogeneous process, whether that's through toolkits, websites, papers, all of those things? They're common to almost all proposals that you get asked to produce. And the challenge of the practice that we tried to bring into Desire and into all of our work is to say, how can we move from scale and replication to really deeply understanding that there are some things that can be scaled, but many things that cannot, that can only work within the biocultural uniqueness of each place. So how can we make room for both of those approaches rather than just one? So the way in which we lifted up the biocultural uniqueness of Kalundborg was through the story of separation mapping and dialogue, but also through our story of place process that we host during Power of Place, that looked at the patterns of Kalundborg over as far back as we can study, ecological, economic, and cultural patterns. And one of the things that showed up really strongly in Kalundborg, it's not entirely unique to Kalundborg, but it expressed itself there in a unique way, was the consistent arrival of external forces over thousands of years that came to Kalundborg because of its incredible rich position as an inland port, because of the rich biodiversity and biology there, but extracted from the place and exported goods, knowledge, materials outwards into the world that had created the conditions for both culture, connection, society to gradually deplete over many thousands of years. To the point where Kalundborg inside Denmark is unregarded as a city and a place, even though the symbiosis is regarded worldwide outside of Denmark. So the question that we asked ourselves was, how could the arrival of the Royal Danish Architecture Group be a catalyst for regeneration of wholeness, community integration, and thrivability going into the future? And that was the core question that we held. So I guess our recommendations around this is really, how do we restructure calls for proposals? And it was really interesting to see in this round of New European Bauhaus, where regeneration has been introduced in 4 calls, Regeno 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the first time. There was much less room for creativity emergence than there was in the initial series within the structure of the proposals. So how can we redesign the structure of calls for proposals to include and value things, what can be scaled, but also what cannot be scaled? And that actually comes back to time and resource, to spend time understanding across a multi-site project, what are those few universal scalable learnings, but how do we take place-sourced regenerative learning and apply it only to other places with very, very similar conditions? Okay, that's kind of it. Very quickly before questions, our invitation to you is, if you are either looking to bring a consortium together, we are always interested not just to be partners in a consortium, but to be a partner that supports you doing this kind of work together. We are already partners in creating regenerative development and learning cultures across these different types of organizations, non-governmental organizations, land management organizations, city authorities, down to the neighborhood project and economic systems. And these are the capabilities and services that we offer. But I would really like to take some time now to hear from you. What questions do you have from what you've heard? I know you've heard an enormous amount of data from us and from the conversation with Åsa and Olivia and Al. What kind of questions, insights, thoughts is it throwing up for you? Let me unspotlight myself so I can see you all. Marvelous, that's better. Ben.
Hi, Jenny.
Hello.
Hi, Al. Thanks very much. That was amazing. Really, really inspiring. There's a few or lots of points popped out at me, but I like the idea of rebranding conflict to emergent potential. I think that's inspired. And this idea of co-creative collaboration feels really important. Moving away from, well, there's some aspects that I just hadn't questioned. So it was amazing to hear what you've got to say there about hypothesis-driven proposals, which is, it's kind of like that's the culture that I am in, really, where you're saying what kind of outcome you're going to achieve and what problem you're going to solve. Yeah, so that's great to put forward a different approach and to be valuing emergence and how exactly you do that is really fascinating and important and a culture shift, I think. And so the question I have, I suppose, is how common are these opportunities for pitching? And is it something that we can do? How do we identify because I've got projects or a project that could really benefit here, I think, especially from, this emergent approach. How do we go about finding people?
That's probably a whole webinar in itself. Let me restrict myself to New European Bauhaus to answer. There are more calls for proposals out there than I've had hot lunches. So the question is finding the ones in which you can participate and you can add value to and can add value to you. New European Bauhaus has both large and small, and also do step in here because you know more about this than I do. This was the first really big sizable round since 2021 that just closed last week in New European Bauhaus. And I don't know when the next round of those at size and scale, to use a word that I've just said I won't use, will be coming. But there's huge amount. One of the sad things for those of us who are from the UK about Brexit was losing temporarily some access to this enormous scale of investment that comes through EU Horizon, which for all the constraints that we've highlighted today, is a wonderful resource. But the UK is now full partners again, and any UK organisation can now participate again without restrictions. So yeah, it's about carving out time to find out what's out there. We fell into Desire by accident, I have to say. We were not looking, and it happened that an organisation that participated in Power of Place invited us in. And I think it would be honest to say we didn't realise how lucky we were. We were a baby organisation that had only been born for 6 months, and found ourselves in this amazing project that gave us an opportunity to really test everything that we thought was true. So yeah, go out and have a look. There are many opportunities, but it is hugely competitive, and you put a lot of effort in with a 5% chance of winning.
Okay, cool. All right, we might need some help there then.
Yeah, Toban.
I wanted to ask a question about, so this principle resonates, relationship before task, and I I have a question about the who of the consortium. And when we think about consortiums, especially when they're this large, 24 different organizations across such a spread of location and context, um, maybe this is sort of like in hindsight or reflection. I don't know if it's easier to ask the question like if you were to do it again,
I just
who would
did.
you who was maybe missing from who needed to be in the consortium that wasn't there, or I'm thinking about, again, one of these things around relationship before task is one way to approach it is because of this time constraint that sometimes we rely or we sort of default, which isn't a bad thing, on the relationships we already have. And that's how we kind of bring in consortium partners into it, rather than starting afresh and building new relationships, because that takes time when maybe those are sometimes needed. So I just a question maybe for the three of you, just a quick reflection on the who, in particular in this case.
It's a really good question. Thank you for that question, because there's always this paradox, right? Is bring in organizations, spend time, which we are actively doing, building relationships with organizations of different kinds across the UK and Europe that could be future consortium partners, finding time to do that. And then, we've been in 2 consortiums recently where there is unquestionably a group and a set of relationships that come together every time. And when new organizations are parachuted into that process, there is instant tension because the existing relationships take priority over welcoming in the new. But I think the principle, the overall commitment to relationship, whether it's across new relationships, across existing relationships, or across a mix of the two, my sense is that it can only pay dividends in terms of the creativity of the output, the longevity of the value that is created. But there's no silver bullet answer to that. I think my personal response is we're almost always, as Really Regenerative and a small organization, the new organization parachuting in to establish relationships, because regeneration, certainly in the context of EU, New European Bauhaus, has only just appeared on the horizon, and in the name of calls for proposals, that doesn't mean those calls for proposals are remotely regenerative. It's just squeaked in as an idea at this stage. I don't know that answers your question, Toban. Orsa, Al, and Olivia, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Also,
no, so because my comments were on something else, but I think, I'll let you answer, Elle.
Okay. I'm sorry, Toban. I'm watching the clock and realizing we're already over time. So Bridget, Orsa, and Al, if you can bring real focus to your question, those of you who can still stay, if you can't stay longer, thank you so much for joining us. But if you would like to squeak out for a few more minutes so that we can get Bridget, Orsa, and Al's questions in, we'll keep going. Bridget.
Thank you. I'll be quick. So most of my work has been in the arts sector, arts and culture, and it struck me as so similar to the findings from so many arts projects, whether or not those projects are about place or regenerative approaches or the circular economy. And I'm interested in the role of artists in the project. Did you find that they were the ones who had the capacities for that emergence and uncertainty, or were they in some ways, as fixed, maybe as the more expert participants? Yeah.
I would like to call on Siv to answer, but she's had to go.
Yeah.
So next group that were the partners who worked in, I'm going to say this wrong also, Herlev in Copenhagen, can't pronounce a Danish word, that brought us into the project are an extraordinarily creative organization. And their experiment was in a new social housing development where they put in place a transparent droplet and invited multiple different artists to engage with the builders on the construction site, the community around the construction site, the potential residents, in a whole series of really super interesting experiments. They were about sound, they were about nature, they were about story, they were about art, they were about sculpture. And the whole project in that place was really deeply able to sit with emergence and really signposted the importance, I think, of putting arts and cultural approaches at the center of experimentation, or at least weaving them in as communities right across. I mean, that's my personal opinion. Åsa and Al may have something different to contribute, but it really added to the emergence, the potential, the richness, and unquestionably, they were much more able to sit with the uncertainty than you would expect the analytical department of a university to be able to do. Completely. Awesome.
Well,
Also, and Al, I'm not sure that you should be asking questions here. We're supposed to be the hosts, but you're allowed as we're closing out.
okay, thank you, Jenny. It's just it was just an addendum to the issue on the European Bauhaus coming calls, because the point is that when we were applying for funding, the European Commission didn't know anything about what the European Bauhaus would be on a practical level. So the calls for proposal at that time was extremely open.
Yeah.
And that was an opportunity we were quite lucky with, I think, because today, if you look at the proposal that connects with European Bauhaus, they become more and more specific.
Yeah.
And that's, for me, sort of disadvantage, or at least there should be openness towards making these very experimental and open projects again. But there was one person from the European Commission that explained this to me and others in a group some months ago, that it was simply because they didn't know what they wanted to see, what does it create of proposals. And based on this, they have now started on making these new topics very specific. And this is what we can expect for the future, which is a bit of a shame.
Well, hopefully we'll send them a copy of this webinar and see if we can change their mind. Al, one last reflection.
It's a less response and reflection to Toban's question. I think it's very difficult to say who should have been there, who wasn't there. But I think, coming back to one of our findings about time and resource, if there had been a participation budget to be able to invite people in who we hadn't first an idea of who should be there, I think that would have been the key thing for me, because that gives you the opportunity to adapt and evolve. And a lot of it was done on the basis of the care that people within the existing consortium would do extra without that budget, would bring food, would give, our colleague gave Jenny and I somewhere to stay. There's all kinds of things where actually it was about care and showing that care for the work and the people. So it was totally relational, but it wasn't built into the design.
And it's also really, really hard, particularly in EU, NEB and Horizon calls, to give remuneration for community members attending events. And that's something that we experienced when we were doing research this year for Joseph Rowntree Foundation, is they, as a funding organisation, put specifics into every commission so that you can at least offer something for people's time, knowledge, in not a transactional, but in recognition and respect of their time and contribution. Okay, we have gone 7 minutes over time. Thank you for those of you who are still with us and stuck with us for the extra 7 minutes. I hope you have found it useful. It was a joyous piece of work for Al and I, if unexpected, when we first birthed Really Regenerative. And we couldn't be more grateful for the surprise opportunity that was Desire, and the opportunity to work with Olivia and Orsa and all of the participants in Desire. We may well have made it sound turbulent, but it was also joyous, insightful, and we learned a huge amount. Thank you all very much. Yeah, if we can be of any help at all, please do call on us. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you.
Orsa, thank you. Olivia, thank you. Al, thank you.